In a city divided by invisible but very real lines, social disparities were starkly clear. On one side, the rich neighborhoods spread out like kingdoms where everything shone: impeccably cleaned streets, sumptuous houses, expensive boutiques whose windows sparkled in the sun. Life there seemed easy, protected by the illusion that poverty did not exist, or at least did not affect them. These neighborhoods were the domain of the privileged, those whose skin color, social status, and connections guaranteed a life of ease, where the problems of everyday life seemed to have little importance. In contrast, in working-class neighborhoods, poverty was omnipresent. The streets were dark, dusty, often neglected by the municipality. The buildings seemed scratched by the years, worn by degradation and the winds of precariousness. The black population, the majority in these areas, lived in the shadow of this two-speed city, condemned to fight every day for their dignity. Here, injustice was a constant, an invisible but omnipresent presence, a heavy weight that marked the lives of the inhabitants, from children to elders. Every glance at these streets, every police patrol, every encounter with the authorities seemed a cruel reminder of their place in the social hierarchy. It is in this context that Jason, a young police officer still at the start of his career, was patrolling. He had not yet fully understood his actions, but his racial prejudices, shaped by his education and early experiences, were already guiding his behavior. On the surface, Jason was doing his job, but deep down, he saw this neighborhood as a zone to be tamed, a lawless land where the some were made to repress the others. The idea that black children could live in conditions as precarious as they were degrading outraged him in his own conception of the world. But rather than questioning the causes of this misery, he chose to see it as a form of rebellion, a lack of respect for the order he represented. For him, these children were only obstacles to a peace that he could not grasp. One hot summer afternoon, with the heat seeming to settle like a burden on the city, Jason raided the park of a run-down neighborhood. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the sound of car engines in the surrounding streets mingled with the distant cries of children playing. The merciless sun beat down relentlessly, but the shade of the trees seemed to offer some respite. It was there that Jason saw Malik, a black boy of around 10, playing alone in the shadow of an old oak tree. Malik, although young, already carried the heavy burdens of his environment on his shoulders. His eyes, piercing and deep, did not reveal the innocence specific to his age. Rather, his gaze seemed filled with a wisdom acquired on the streets, a painful wisdom, forged by the daily struggles he faced, even at his young age. He was not yet accustomed to the cruelty of the outside world, but his eyes already betrayed the experience of the injustices he had to face. Jason, seeing the child, suddenly felt superior. His gaze hardened. The smile he wore was cold, contemptuous. For no apparent reason, he approached the boy, a feeling of power rising within him, reinforced by his police uniform. He pointed to a rat that was wandering near Malik, digging in the trash. The scene, depicting a picture of absolute misery, proved to be an excuse for Jason to further demean the child. "Do you know what that is, kid?" Jason asked in an icy voice, his face frozen in an expression of intolerance. Malik, at first frozen by surprise, instinctively stepped back, feeling that the situation was becoming dangerous. His heart was beating faster, but before he could react, Jason grabbed his arm with disconcerting force. "I want you to eat this rat. That way you'll know what it's like to live here." "You don't have respect, so I'm going to teach you respect," Jason said, his commanding voice filled with disgust not only for Malik, but for everything this child represented in his eyes: poverty, rebellion, powerlessness.
Terror invades Malik.
Every fiber of his being screamed at him to flee, to defend himself, but he knew that, alone, faced with the imposing silhouette of the policeman, he had no chance. The intensity of the psychological, but also physical violence that fell upon him paralyzed him. He tried to free himself, but Jason, implacable, held him tightly. No adult was there to help him. No one would come and intervene. In this world, this kind of act seemed to be the norm. But what Jason didn't know was that Malik was not a child like the others. Malik was the son of Samuel Johnson, an FBI agent respected for his integrity, courage, and determination. Samuel had dedicated his life to justice, to the fight against organized crime and the injustices of the system. Although he had a demanding schedule, he never lost sight of what really mattered: his family, and especially his son. Samuel had taught Malik to stand up straight, to remain dignified despite trials, but he had not yet explained to him how the cruelty of the world could sometimes reach unimaginable heights. In this moment of terror, Malik, in the hands of the brutal policeman, thought of his father. He knew that his father, although often absent, was strong. He knew he would be there to help her, that he would do whatever it took to get justice. But right now, he felt terribly alone. His gaze, filled with fear and shame, turned towards the ground, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow him up. The pain of humiliation coiled around his heart, like a slow poison, eating away at his dignity and innocence. That day, Samuel returned home early, a rarity in his work routine. He was used to coming home late, often after Malik had gone to sleep, but this time he had taken time off work to spend time with him. He entered the house with a strange feeling of alarm, an intuition that tightened his heart. The atmosphere inside was strange, almost heavy. He saw Malik motionless in a corner of the living room, his face bathed in tears, an expression he had never seen on his son's face. Samuel rushed towards him, his heart beating faster. His hands shook slightly as he knelt beside her. "What happened, my son?" he asked, his voice soft but tinged with worry. Malik slowly looked up, a look of terror mixed with shame in his eyes. He felt broken, as if an immense weight was weighing on his shoulders. His lips trembled as he recited the incident, the words falling like stones, heavy and painful. "He forced me. He told me that I had to eat the rat." Malik's voice broke under the weight of memory, but he continued, pouring out the flood of injustices and humiliations he had experienced. Samuel listened, his mind swirling, a mixture of rage and sadness. Every word from his son rang like a bell in his soul, and a cold anger rose within him, an anger he was not used to showing. He had seen horrors in his career, but he never imagined that his own son, in his own town, would fall victim to the cruelty of the man who was supposed to be there to protect the community. "I'll take care of this," Samuel said in a calm but determined voice, although the whirlwind of emotions fought inside him. He took a deep breath and stood up, determined not to let this vile act pass without consequence. In the days that followed, Samuel embarked on careful preparation. He knew what he had to do wouldn't be easy. He began by gathering evidence, discreetly interviewing witnesses who had seen the incident, looking for clues in neighborhood surveillance cameras, and exploring other avenues to make the injustice visible. Some witnesses were reluctant, for fear of reprisals, but a small group agreed to speak, determined to break the silence that grew around Jason's abuse of power. The evidence began to pile up, each testimony and each piece a piece of a complex puzzle. Samuel knew that justice could sometimes be slow and biased, but he firmly believed that if one persisted, the truth would eventually emerge. Yet he also knew he had to play carefully. Jason, with his allies in the police department, thought he was safe, and Samuel did not want to rush things at the risk of seeing the affair hushed up. Time passed, and each day Samuel fought in the shadows, gathering support, studying the flaws in the system, and tracking down evidence he knew was invaluable. Finally, after weeks of strenuous effort, Samuel felt ready. He filed the complaint against Jason, demanding a formal investigation. The police officer, imbued with his power and his status, thought that nothing would disturb his daily life. He thought he was protected, sheltered from consequences. But Samuel had prepared his shot with clinical precision. The pressure began to build. The media picked up on the story, attracting public attention. Protests erupted in the streets, with citizen voices rising to denounce police brutality, abuse of power, and systemic racial discrimination. Samuel knew this was more than just a matter of justice for his son. It was a fight for the dignity of an entire community, for truth against oppression. Jason, confronted with the magnitude of the matter, began to feel the heat of the fire approaching. The police officer was suspended and then indicted. The affair became a focal point, a symbol of resistance against the abuses of power. Samuel, without trying to make a name for himself, fought for things to change. It was not a personal victory, but a victory for his son, for his community, and for all those who fought in the shadows of society. Days passed, and the situation took an irreversible turn. Police impunity, once entrenched, began to crack. But in the midst of the turmoil, Samuel remained calm. His gaze always turned towards the future, towards justice. For him, it was just one step in a bigger struggle. The change wasn't immediate, but he knew that each victory, no matter how small, was one step closer to a more just world. Jason, for his part, found himself immersed in shame and guilt. He understood too late that his actions were not without consequences, that the violence he had inflicted on an innocent child had shaken a force much greater than himself. He had acted with arrogance and impunity, but he could no longer ignore the reality. His abuse of power had triggered a mobilization that nothing could stop. Malik, now, was growing up under the shadow of this event. The boy who had been terrified that day was changing. Fear had transformed into inner strength. He would never forget what had happened, but he knew that his father, Samuel, and the justice he embodied, would always be there for him, to offer him the protection he had once thought unattainable. And every day, he learned to fight, to defend his rights and those of others, to never allow himself to be silenced by those who believed they could dominate the most vulnerable.